I'm Rachel Belle, and this is Your Last Meal, the show where celebrities share stories about the foods they love most, and we dig into the history, culture, or science of those meals with experts from around the world. Today on the program, documentary filmmaker Ken Burns. Ken has produced and directed over 30 films on topics ranging from country music, the American buffalo, baseball, the Brooklyn Bridge, and the Vietnam War, all distributed by PBS. And he's won 17 Emmy Awards, 2 Grammy Awards, and snagged 2 Oscar nominations along the way. His latest is Leonardo da Vinci, a 2-part series that debuts on PBS November 18th and 19th. But Ken also has sway in the culinary world. You have a dish named after you, the Ken salad.
The Ken salad. And it's, kind of embarrassing when you're at the next table and people go, I think I'm going to get the Ken salad. And I eat it all the time, particularly when I'm hard at work in the editing room and somebody goes down and gets it and pulls it out for me during work.
Ken's eponymous salad is served at a very special restaurant that he will tell you about in just a bit. Let's jump right into my conversation with Ken Burns. Most people in their lives don't have a moment to pinpoint where their life changed or why they decided on the career that they did, but you were very young when you had one moment you remember that you decided that you wanted to be a filmmaker.
Yeah, it's sort of born out of tragedy, Rachel. It's my mom had cancer for the first 8.5, 9 years of my life. She died when I was 11, just a few months short of my 12th birthday. And I remember that my dad, I'd never seen my dad cry, not when she was sick, not when she died, not at her impossibly sad funeral. And so he let me stay up and watch movies with him. And I remember watching an old movie from Sir Carol Reed about the Irish Trouble starring James Mason, and my dad started to cry. And I instantaneously got it, that there was something about his life that had not provided him with any sort of emotional safe haven. There was no port he could call on that would just allow him to let down his hair. And a film did that. And I just went, wow, that's what I want to do. I want to, I later on called it to be an emotional archaeologist, to sort of excavate, not nostalgic or sentimental things, but deep, deep emotions. And that meant this was 1965, that I was going to be, a Hollywood director like Alfred Hitchcock. And I ended up going to Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, a new experimental school. I came the second year it was open. It's still wonderful and experimenting. I urge everyone to send all their children there. It's not transactional college experience. It's transformational. And all of my teachers were social documentary still photographers and filmmakers, and reminded me that there is as much drama in what is and what was as anything of the human imagination. And I became a documentary filmmaker, and then one in history. It's just very simple. I'm very, very lucky. Stars aligned, and out of tragedy, something really positive happened. I found out what I was supposed to be doing. I found out I was okay at it. I've been doing it for, 50 years.
I also went to college thinking I was going to be a film director and came out a broadcast journalist. So you just don't know what's going to happen. I think it is so influential. And you also, at that age, you're 17, you don't know what any job is yet.
No. And at 17 to 22, you also know everything.
Yeah.
And now I'm 71 and I know nothing.
Yeah.
And I'm really okay with that. and I always call on the interns because they always know everything. And I really want to know what somebody who knows everything knows. And then we operate from the fact that most of us know nothing.
Well, I'm so sorry that you lost your mom at such a young age. I've listened to interviews of you talking about it, and obviously it was hard for you and your brother, but it sounds like your dad really struggled as well. And I'm curious, what was food like, eating, cooking? Who was cooking after your mom passed, and what were you eating?
Swanson TV dinners. We sort of divided it up, which meant that my brother did 2 nights, I did 2 nights, and my dad did 3 nights. And it basically 5 out of 6 were Swanson TV dinners. And my dad was, he was a Frenchophile, was an anthropologist. I spent the first year of my life in the highest village in France. So he actually could cook and did at times. And it was pretty wonderful. But, I had a typical 50s, 60s childhood. I grew up, the vegetables we had were frozen. Rarely had a salad. Yeah, it was interesting. We were too impoverished by illness and insurance deficits to go out to eat. But when we did, it was like once a year. And, it cost $12 for a family of 4 and then 3. So I just remember that kind of thing. Although once I decided to go off the reservation and make duckling l'orange. And I think it came out terribly. I was making it for a colleague of my father, my brother, and I think it was terrible.
When you were a kid, you made duck à l'orange?
Yeah, I mean, 12, 13 years old.
Yeah.
But the last 3 or 4 Christmases, without a recipe or anything, I've roasted a duck à l'orange, and it's come out fantastically. And when I didn't have a rack to hold the duck up in the roasting pan, I built one of celery. And right?
Like Lincoln you're making logs, a campfire.
Lincoln logs is exactly.
Yeah.
And it worked out really great. And of course, every orange that I cut and squeezed over it, I then put in the pan, and we brought some marmalade and cooked that in a saucepan and put it on. And it somehow, took the temperature, and girls, I think it's done, and then the girls go, yeah, this is really good.
Amazing. I didn't know celery had such good structural integrity after it'd been in the oven for a while.
It did. You have to build up a little bit, but it does retain its, you think of the fibers in them, it's not going to completely fall apart.
In 1979, Ken and his then wife, Amy Steckler, moved from a New York City apartment to a rental house in Walpole, New Hampshire. This was an economic decision. Small town prices made it much easier for 2 early career filmmakers to pay their rent. Eventually, they were able to convince the landlord to sell them that house. Both of their children were born there, in their bedroom, and Ken still lives in that house to this day. You said, there's nothing I love more than being on a road in America that I've never been on before. It's second only to the road that leads up to the hill to my home. That is my favorite road, is coming home.
Yeah, all day.
Tell me about, we talked a little bit about your food life growing up. What about now? What is the vibe in your kitchen? Who cooks now?
So being a single dad twice, I really have to get down and do stuff. We love the intimacy of cooking. We love what it's like to do stuff together, even if it's what we call a boom done pasta, where you're just making it all in one thing, and you've got some veggies and some mozzarella and some, penne or whatever it is, and just making something super delicious that is easy to make, but just because we're all there together. And all of my girls love to bake, make cookies. So the house is sort of filled with that. And it's a big, nice, workable kitchen. So it's good. And then I have a housekeeper who, when I'm on the road, when I come back, makes what we call a Gigi salad. Her name is Karen, but everybody calls her Gigi because my youngest couldn't say Karen, but could Gigi. So we call her that. And it's basically chopped vegetables, usually cruciferous. It's broccoli and or cauliflower and cabbage, and then whatever. And she's been making it for 10 years, and it's never the same. I've never had the same salad twice. And then that lives in a tub that I just eat out of for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, for whatever, until it's gone. And then I need another one, or more than likely I'm back on the road.
How much are you on the road compared to being home?
Well, I complain a lot about it, but it's not as bad. It will be next year when we promote the American Revolution, but I'm gone at least 1.5 to 2 weeks a month.
Okay.
I have got a dog who I miss, and he misses me, and I do a lot of walking with him when I'm there. It's okay. It's part of the job, and a lot of it's fundraising, a lot of it's shooting, which I love. A lot of it's, being in New York, just because that's where a lot of film work happens.
Right. More than 20 years ago, he helped open a French bistro in Walpole called The Restaurant at Burdick's. You co-own a restaurant.
I do. I'm the classic silent partner. That is to say, or I wish I could say that I don't talk with my mouth full. I'm silent.
Yeah.
It's just a wonderful little tiny village that can't really support a restaurant this big. So we've been making it happen now since for 23 years. It's been really a terrific thing. It's the best thing for miles around. And I just eat there as often as I can and tip heavily and never take a free meal and put money in. It never makes money, but it's such an important part of the community. And I love it.
Yeah. Well, tell me how this started. How did you get involved in the restaurant business?
So I'm not. So our little town had an IGA supermarket that moved out to a plaza in the early 80s. I came in 79 to this town 45 years ago, and it lay empty. The absentee landlord didn't care about it. And Everybody made runs. I would help different groups try to do it. Nothing would happen. A friend of mine, a guy who moved to town later on, who was a chocolatier named Larry Burdick, had his own little chocolate shop and for pastries and coffees and teas. And he always wanted to put in a restaurant. So I said, I'll help you. And we finally were able to wrestle the building and the space away. And he turned it into a wonderful thing. He's now not involved with it, but it just sort of sputters on and is just this wonderful thing. And people come, and it's great to cruise in this tiny New Hampshire town. The foreign license plates, the other states are represented outside, and it's got a nice word of mouth, and it's a really beautiful place to be in.
When Ken is home in Walpole, he tends to eat most of his meals at Burdick's.
Living in this little village with this restaurant, which is, except for Sunday nights and Mondays and Tuesday nights, it's open.
Yeah.
So I can default to the best pantry that I could possibly imagine, and I do. And now as my girls get older and older, there's less of that.
Maybe you are still silent, but your name is known. You have a dish named after you.
Yeah, but so that's even more accidental. They had something, maybe chicken on a salad, and I kept sort of saying, would you try this? And they grilled some salmon, and then I had them switch it to Bibb lettuce, and there was something missing, and I had them add avocado, and that was heading in the right direction. And we shaved some Parmesan and had a light lemon vinaigrette. It was off the menu for 10 years, and they would just serve it to me and whoever knew how to ask for it. And then they put it on one summer, and it was the best seller. They took it off just because it was nothing like really what they were interested in doing. And they put it back on several years ago, and it's been on, and it is a big seller.
The Ken salad.
The Ken salad. And it's, kind of embarrassing when you're at the next table and people go, I think I'm going to get the Ken salad. And I eat it all the time, particularly when I'm hard at work in the editing room and somebody goes down and gets it and pulls it out for me during work. And then I explore all the other wonderful dimensions of the menu when I'm there in person.
Ken salad is Bibb lettuce, avocado, grilled salmon, Parmesan, and a lemon vinaigrette. And it is on all three of Burdick's menus: lunch, brunch, and dinner. There are a lot of popular dishes and foods that were named after real people. Eggs Benedict, the Caesar salad, graham crackers, Salisbury steak. Did you know that the Granny Smith apple was named after a real granny?
Her name was Maria Ann Granny Smith.
That's journalist Larry Fleury. He wrote a piece for the Farmer's Almanac titled 14 Popular Foods Named After Real People. Maria Ann Smith had 8 children, so in her later years, people called her Granny Smith. In 1855, Granny Smith and her husband bought an orchard in New South Wales, Australia, and started cultivating apples. As legend has it, she was cooking with some French crab apples and threw their cores and seeds near a creek on their property. Soon after, a volunteer apple tree sprouted after being pollinated by something else in the wild. And this produced a new strain of apple. And Granny Smith was impressed by its flavor and how well it stored. She started propagating these green apples and selling them at Sydney's George Street Market. And people started really digging them.
Obviously, it produced these beautiful green, kind of tarty apples, so people really took to it.
Granny Smith died a few years later, but other Australian apple growers picked up where she left off, and Granny Smith's apples were eventually exported around the world. A lot of these origin stories are more like legends, like Dr. Pepper. The Dr. Pepper Museum says there are a dozen different stories for how the soda got its name. Dr. Pepper was invented in Morrison's Old Corner Drugstore in Waco, Texas in 1885 by a young pharmacist named Charles Alderton. This was back when drugstores were also soda fountains. And according to Dr. Pepper's website, the store's owner, Wade Morrison, named it Dr. Pepper after Dr. Charles Pepper, a Virginia doctor who was the father of a girl he was once in love with. Can you imagine? You name your soda, your company, after your crush's dad, and you still don't end up with her. Bummer, dude. All right, let's move on to the Cobb salad, a story that may or may not be true. Here's Larry.
The story of the Cobb salad starts in 1937 in Hollywood, California, at Brown Derby Restaurant. And the owner, Bob Cobb, was looking for something to eat. So he's just pulling out random items from his refrigerator. And as you could tell, it's lettuce, hard-boiled eggs, tomatoes, chives, cheese, avocado. And so while the bacon was being cooked in the restaurant, he grabbed a couple slices, broke it up, threw them in the salad. And that's kind of, the tale of the Cobb salad. He ate it. Some other people tried it, kind of blew up and became a big deal. So I heard people call it girl dinner, kind of throwing together what you have in the fridge.
Oh my God. I love the idea that Bob Cobb in 1937 made a girl dinner.
Yes. I love it.
If you could have a dish named after you, what would it be? I got this message from listener Barbara.
My dish would be Barbara's Bodacious Bananas. It's a childhood recipe and it's very simple, but I love it. You take a piece of toast, you slather it with peanut butter, I like chunky. Then you take half a banana, I like very ripe, and you roll up the banana in the peanut butter covered toast and you eat it. It's the best breakfast with a strong cup of coffee, but it's good any time of day. It was one of my favorite childhood recipes, and I still love it today. We called it a banana roll-up, but I like Barbara's Bodacious Bananas better. Bye.
Have I ever told you guys about my obsession with spaghetti and meatball-filled calzones? Several years ago, I was passing through Salt Lake City on a road trip with a friend, and we had just been on a big hiking trip, so we ordered a bunch of pizza to go at a place called the Pie Pizzeria, and at the very last minute, I threw in the Vesuvius, which is a spaghetti and meatball calzone. I love novelty, I love carbs on carbs, and this calzone turned out to be the best thing that we ordered. Super saucy inside, perfectly chewy dough, and we enjoyed it by watching a Golden Girls marathon at a motel. So my dish would be called Calzone Rachel, a saucy spaghetti and meatball stuffed calzone, but mine would be topped with a mound of cold, crisp, croutonless Caesar salad. I love piling salad on top of a pizza slice, so I imagine the same hot, cold, soft, crisp contrast would be just as good on a calzone. All right, my little calzones, let's take a quick break, and then we'll be back with Ken and his last meal. We're back with documentary filmmaker Ken Burns. What would your last meal be?
God, I've been agonizing over this. The best meal I think I've ever had was at a restaurant called Zachariah in Amalfi. I'd been making a film in the 90s on Thomas Jefferson, and I went up to Ravello to film Gore Vidal. And afterwards, he took us down to this restaurant, and it was just spectacular. I mean, it just started with the simplest bruschetta and then sardines that were just freshly caught, not salted, little tiny snails that you needed like literally a pin to pick them out. This was a multi-course dinner. It was like at the end of it, I just was alive. The white wine, I think it came out of the tap. I mean, it had that kind of sense of it just being the only liquid you needed. It was an amazing meal. And I was able to recreate it a few years later. I went back there, I found the restaurant, and I said, Signora Vidal. And so they bring, and this time it has 4 other courses. He'd skipped the pasta. And so now we had pasta in addition. And he skipped it for the obvious reason, you slow down after about 4 pasta courses.
Oh,
anyway,
amazing.
It still ranks. But I'll tell you, the Burdick's, the restaurant that I am, sort of supposed to be involved in, but just eat at. Whenever I'm on the road and I come back, the first thing I order is their roasted chicken, which comes, I assume they use a brick or something to crisp the skin. It's filleted, half a chicken. There's only a tiny little drumstick, and the rest is equally moist, dark, and light and white meat. And it's in a brown jus that has a kind of, it's sort of like jet fuel. It's the most amazing thing. And underneath it are braised leeks, and they usually dump really delicious mashed potatoes in straws. But I'm at that age where I just get a side of greens, skip the potatoes, and I get this big, gigantic plate of this thing. And it is, and I know 3 or 4 people who, independent, we've never compared notes until recently, think it's the best meal on the planet. So
Wow.
if I'm heading to my execution, I said, where, is this like a violent show? It's like this like last
No.
meal? Because most people's last meal are like IV something in a hospital that's me, whatever. But I kind of presumed that I was taking the last walk down to and so it would definitely be this roasted chicken from Burdick's in Walpole, New Hampshire.
Yes, it's definitely a catalyst for conversation, just kind of a fantasy thing.
Like, what did I do?
Exactly. Well, that's interesting. Some people answer it differently like that. I don't know what is going on with the light here. I was talking to Ken over Zoom, and I was sitting at a table next to a big window, and my entire face was suddenly covered with like a gauzy white sheet of heavenly light.
I love it. Can I just say, as a filmmaker, I love it. You've got some backlight, and it's just radiating, and it's sort of Jacob's ladders as you aid in your own thing.
That's what I was thinking. I'm like, there's some kind of religious something happening here.
It's got to be. Maybe it has to do with the Last Supper. We just made a film, Leonardo da Vinci.
Yeah.
Arguably his great painting, in addition, most famous painting. We know what his most famous painting, but arguably his greatest painting is the Last Supper, which is magnificent. So maybe we're all in key, and it's Leonardo or somebody even higher than Leonardo who's just talking to you right now.
He's here. This show is about last meals, and Ken is about to release a new documentary about Leonardo da Vinci, the man who painted The Last Supper. Could the stars have aligned any better? For years and years, I had a big, gaudy painting of The Last Supper in my bathroom, in a big, gaudy, fake gold frame. I found the painting at a thrift store. And sometimes when I would brush my teeth or do my skincare routine, I would just stare at this painting and wonder, what are they eating? So let me refresh you on the painting. There is a long wooden table. Jesus is seated in the center, and he's surrounded by 12 apostles. And on the table, it looks like there are little round dinner rolls, or maybe they're small potatoes just scattered across the table. There are little glasses of red wine, something sliced on a plate, and a couple other foods that I could never quite make out. And the Bible rudely fails to mention what they are eating. So I called up Generoso Orcioli, an Italian archaeologist who specializes in the history of early Christianity. He wrote the book Jerusalem, The Last Supper, and researches Jewish writings, ancient Palestinian food, ancient paintings where food is present, and meals mentioned in the New Testament. And Generoso concluded that everything edible depicted in the famous Leonardo da Vinci Last Supper painting is inaccurate. Generoso explains that the food on Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper table is Italian and represents what was eaten in his era.
In the masterpiece of Leonardo, we found the typical food of Italy, of the land of Italy. Some fruit, some fish. The wine is the wine of the Italy.
But Jesus and the apostles were Middle Eastern, not Italian. And the Last Supper is said to have taken place in the 1st century AD. He also disputes the way they're seated at the table.
They would not have eaten sitting on a chair, and they would not have used the table.
Generoso says the food would have been served communally in big earthenware bowls, and they would have been sitting on the floor on cushions around a low table. They would have eaten everything with their hands and used no utensils.
There was no special cutlery. People ate with their hands.
Even bread wasn't sliced with a knife. You would just tear off a chunk from the loaf. In the Last Supper paintings, the wine is always red. But Generoso says there is no way of knowing if Jesus liked a nice Chianti or if he was more of a rosé all day kind of guy. So what were they eating at the Last Supper?
It's a sort of guess what. Why? Because according to the public's imagination, the Last Supper took place during the Passover celebration.
If Jesus was Jewish and therefore kosher, and the Last Supper was a sort of Passover Seder, which many historians believe it was, Generoso thinks they would have been eating lamb and a stewed bean dish called cholent, which is still eaten by many Jewish people today, not including me, because when I was 10 years old, my mom's friend made a very gross version, and I have never wanted to eat it since. If it was in fact a Passover meal, the bread would have to be unleavened, kind of like the matzah that we eat today. Generoso says the table might have also had olives, an herb with a mint-like taste, bitter herbs with pistachio, a charoset, which is a chunky fruit and nut paste that we still eat on Passover today. I make mine with apples and walnuts, honey and red wine. He thinks there could have been dates, and most likely a fermented fish sauce that was also very popular with ancient Romans. Generoso left me with one more fascinating fact. Despite the fact that the wine is supposed to represent Jesus' blood, he says the current pope exclusively drinks white wine, and it has to be organic and natural.
It's very interesting. Wine used by the Pope are not red, is white. First of all, it must be biologically active and alive and must not have undergone any chemical treatment either in the vineyard or the cellar, nor waste sulfite be added to it. But only white grapes from different farms are used for this wine. It's very interesting. It's not red, it's white.
If Ken Burns was making a documentary about food or eating or cooking, what would it be about? He'll tell us after the break. I'm so curious. I'm sure you get asked this a lot. How do you choose the topics of your films? Is it from what you're interested in? Do you see a little nugget somewhere and you start pulling the thread? Is it what you think America is interested in?
Not the latter, but the first two are pretty good. Sometimes you hear somebody will say something. I was visiting a friend. We were working, trying to figure out whether a big, as they call it, tentpole multi-series project. You were doing early thinking and research on it. And a friend of mine said, have you ever thought about country music? And I went, whoa, like that. Literally.
That's it.
I went back to my partner. And I said, we don't have to get rid of this thing, but what about country music? And from then on, we've never talked about that thing again. And we spent, 7 or 8 years making a film on country music. Sometimes it's reading a book. Sometimes it's hearing stories over the years. It's never marketing research. It's never like, oh, what we need to do now is this because of this. And everybody, it's always self-initiated. I can do it if I can raise the money, and I do. It takes a long time, but you can sort of do what you're doing now. We're working on an impossibly hard project on the history of the American Revolution. No photographs, no newsreels. Mm-hmm. And so it's really hard to calibrate all that stuff, but, it's just as exhilarating as anything. And I've been waking up at 3 a.m. all my professional life going, how are we going to do this?
Yes.
And then it happens, and I think, maybe if I've learned anything, it's just to trust a process, to be really honest and direct. We're not going to compromise the process, but more than that, to just trust it.
It can take Ken and his team 8 to 10 years to complete a project. Part of that time is spent funding his projects, and he owns all of his own work. And he and his production company, Florentine Films, are always working on multiple films at once, which is why he prefers working with PBS. He says he could sign with a big streaming platform and they would give him all of the money he needs to make the film up front. But only PBS will let him spend a decade on these films, making them exactly how he wants them. Why Leonardo da Vinci? What was it about that topic for you?
This film is equally, if not more, my oldest daughter, my mia primogenita, and my son-in-law. This is the greatest, I don't know how to describe him, the most curious man on earth. He probably knew more than anyone else ever knew at the time. He is arguably the greatest painter, but painted less than 20, and only 10 of them or less than 10 of them are finished. He's certainly got the most famous painting in the world. He's the greatest scientist of his age. There's stuff that he was working on in his notebooks that were proved nearly 500 years after his death. And he's still relevant and modern now. And he's sort of combining a Western tradition of observation with what the Renaissance opens up is contact with the Western world, a Muslim and Asian. He wants to know everything. And so you can look at the Mona Lisa and see it as a great work of science. And you can look at his anatomies and see them as great works of art. We give him all these adjectives. Oh, he's an inventor and he's a scientist and he's an anatomist and a biologist and an artist and a sculptor and a drawer. And I guess so, but he would never, ever think that he was ever changing hats at any time. He was doing the same thing, which is this pursuit of the big, big questions. There's nobody better. I mean, if the cliche is we use 10% of our brain, if that's true, he's using 75. And don't you want to know more about that?
One of the things that I love the most about the work that I get to do is I just think that there are so many stories with food. I mean, it's politics, it's immigration, it's history. I mean, beyond everybody's personal stories, there's so much richness. If you were, or have you ever considered doing a documentary that was around food, what would the subject be? What would you do it on?
I do it in New Orleans, which is in America, one of my favorite places to eat. I just took my youngest there for the first time. We had the best time. I took her to Galatoire's and they just made a big deal over her first meal there and Commander's Palace. And there's something about, everything flows down the Mississippi, all of the richness, all of the culture is also all the history of French and Spanish and English and other American overlays, the slave culture of the Caribbean and South America, sort of everything sort of meets there. And I made a film on Huey Long, my third film. I spent a lot of time in Louisiana, out in the bayous with ordinary folks, at crawfish boils. And there's something really direct and wonderful about the food down there.
Yeah, I've heard some people say that they believe it's one of the only true American cuisines. I think it's like 7 different cultures coming together to create something.
Right, so it distinguishes it, and it's the only American culture, is the fact that it has all these cultures mixed together, and you get an unbelievable, you've got jazz, you've got Creole, you have all sorts of influences, and it was the gumbo that created jazz, but it also created gumbo and lots of other things that you make our lives better.
And that was Ken Burns' last meal. Ken Burns' newest production, Leonardo da Vinci, will air November 18th and 19th on PBS. It's a 2-part series, and then it will continue to air for a month after that. Consider becoming a Cascade PBS Passport member. You get on-demand access to all PBS programming, everything from Ken Burns' entire collection to the huge collection of PBS cooking shows, which is what I grew up watching with my family. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of cooking and food shows, all the classics like Julia Child and Yan Can Cook, and new shows like Homemade Live, hosted by my buddy, Joel Gamaran. You can find a link to join Passport in the show notes. Your Last Meal is a product of Seattle's Cascade PBS. This episode was produced with Maliha Syed and mixed and mastered by Isaac Kaplan-Woolner, who does the best Shaggy karaoke impression you'll ever hear. Original theme music by Prom Queen. And I created, host, and co-produce Your Last Meal. Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast so you never miss an episode. We will be back next week with a little more Ken Burns on The Leftovers. And finally, check out my website, hellorachelbelle.com, to see all of the events I have coming up. On November 20th, I am hosting a super fun culinary game show called Food Fight. So bring your buddies, get a team together for food trivia, silly interactive games, surprise snacks, and pop-ins from some of our favorite Seattle chefs. My cookbook, Open Sesame, is out so soon, finally, on November 12th, and I have a bunch of events happening in the Pacific Northwest. Come visit me at a farmer's market demo and have a little taste from the book, or come to a book talk at Powell's in Portland. All the details are up at hellorachelbelle.com. I'm Rachel Belle, and this is Your Last Meal. Thank you so much for your time. It was such a joy to meet you, and I apologize for being a couple minutes late.
Oh, no. My God. I was on a Zoom the other night in which it took Tom Hanks was the guest of honor, and he couldn't get in for 25 minutes. And you could imagine the bullets that were sweated then. It's fine.
Everyone gives Tom Hanks a break.
Well, it wasn't his fault. It was, I guess, the organizer's fault. And
Oh.
but he was freaking out, and couldn't have been lovelier, and everything was good. So
Nice. Well, thanks again. Take care.
my pleasure. You too. Bye.